The padlock on my own front door was the first thing I saw when I came back from the barn that evening. My clothes were stuffed in a garbage bag on the porch. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway and laughed. "The barn's still open," she said. "That's where you belong." 12 acres of Whitfield land, 4 generations of roots, and my own son didn't say a word. But Margaret knew this day would come. She'd known for years, and the phone number she left hidden in her Bible was about to change everything. I need to tell you this story from the beginning, because what happened that evening didn't start with a padlock. It started with love, with land, with a woman who saw the future more clearly than I ever could. Let me start with what I saw when I came up the path from the south pasture that October afternoon, my boots caked with mud, my hands still smelling of the salve I'd rubbed into old Bessie's cracked hoof. The sun was sinking behind the maple ridge, throwing long shadows across the yard. The kitchen light was on, which meant Brenda was home early. That should have been my first warning. Brenda never came home early unless she wanted something, or unless she'd already taken it. I climbed the porch steps the way I've climbed them 10,000 times. The third board creaking under my weight, the railing smooth from decades of hands, gripping it through rain and snow and summer heat. My hand reached for the door, and that's when I felt it. Cold metal, where warm brass used to be. A padlock, brand new, still shiny, clamped over a latch that hadn't been there when I left that morning. I stood there trying to make sense of what my fingers were telling me. This was my house. The house my grandfather built in 1921. The house my father was born in. The house where I carried Margaret over the threshold on our wedding night while she laughed so hard she nearly dropped her bouquet, and someone had locked me out of it. The garbage bag sat by the door, black plastic stretched tight around what I could already tell were my things. The corner of a flannel shirt poked through a tear in the side. The shape of my shaving kit pressed against the bottom. The front door opened and Brenda stepped out, wearing that cream-colored blouse she always puts on when she wants to look like she's in charge. Her arms were crossed. Her chin was lifted. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog that keeps coming back to a porch where it's not welcome. "Oh, good, you're back," she said, like I'd just returned from an errand she'd sent me on. "Ryan and I have discussed it, and we think it's best if you use the barn for a while, just until we figure out the next steps." She paused and added with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, "That's more your level anyway." I looked past her into the hallway my father had paneled with oak from the woodlot behind the north pasture. The light from Margaret's kitchen, where she'd painted sunflowers on the cabinet doors by hand, fell across the floor in a warm yellow rectangle. "Where's Ryan?" I asked. Brenda tilted her head toward the upstairs window. "He's busy." I looked up. The bedroom curtain moved. Just a twitch. Barely there. But I saw it. My son was standing behind that curtain, watching his father get thrown out of his own home, and he didn't have the courage to show his face. The curtain fell still. Something cracked inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been cracking slowly for 18 months. Hairline fractures spreading through it, like frost through old concrete. This was something deeper, something structural. The kind of crack that means the whole thing is about to give. I'm a veterinarian. 42 years I spent driving these back roads with my medical bag on the passenger seat, delivering calves at 3 in the morning, stitching up horses that tangled with barbed wire, sitting with farmers while their oldest dog took its last breath. I've held life in my hands and I've held death, and I've learned that most of the time the difference between the two is just stubbornness. But standing on that porch with a garbage bag full of my belongings and a padlock on my own door, I felt something I'd never felt in 4 decades of hard work and hard weather. I felt erased. "You can't do this," I said. "This is my home. My name is on the deed. 4 generations of Whitfields have lived on this land." Brenda leaned against the doorframe, blocking the entrance. "George," she said. Using that patient voice she saves for moments when she wants to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "You're 70 years old. You can't manage 12 acres by yourself. You can barely manage yourself. You locked me out of my house and you're calling that helping. The patience vanished. This house needs real owners, George, not a ghost from the past who can't let go. She stepped back inside, one hand on the door. Take the bag. The barn has a space heater. You'll be fine. The door closed. The new lock clicked from inside. I stood on that porch until the shadows stretched across the yard and climbed the side of the barn. The last light caught the maple ridge and turned it copper, then bronze, then nothing. I picked up the garbage bag. It was heavier than I expected. Not because of what was inside, but because of what it meant. 70 years on this land, and everything I was allowed to keep fit in a single bag of black plastic. I walked toward the barn and did not look back. Not because I was strong, but because I knew if I saw that curtain twitch again, something inside me would break in a way that couldn't be fixed. The barn was cold. October wind found every crack between the boards. I pulled the string on the overhead bulb, and it swayed, throwing shadows across the empty stalls. Old Bessie looked up from her hay and blinked. She was the last one. Brenda had sold the rest of the herd months ago. 12 dairy cows, gone in a single afternoon, loaded into a trailer by strangers while I watched everything Margaret and I had built get carted away. I sat on a hay bale and opened the bag. Clothes, books, my reading glasses. The framed photo of Margaret and me at the county fair, 1983. Both of us sunburned and laughing. The glass was cracked from being shoved in without wrapping. And at the bottom, beneath everything else, my hand closed around something familiar. Leather-bound. Heavy. The edges worn soft from decades of handling. Margaret's Bible. The one she kept on her nightstand every night of our marriage. The one she held during the last Sunday service she ever attended, 6 weeks before the stroke took her from me. I pulled it out and held it against my chest. It felt heavier than leather and paper and faith. Like something was hiding inside, waiting for the right hands to find it. The barn light was too dim to read by, and my hands were shaking too badly to turn pages, so I sat in the cold, holding my dead wife's Bible against my heart, listening to the wind find its way through the cracks, and I waited for morning. Morning came the way it always does in Vermont in October, slow and gray. The light creeping through the gaps between the barn boards, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. I opened my eyes and found myself still sitting upright on the hay bale. Margaret's Bible pressed against my chest, my neck stiff, my fingers numb from the cold. Bessie was watching me from her stall with those big patient eyes, chewing her cud like nothing in the world had changed. Maybe for her it hadn't. Animals don't understand betrayal. They don't know what it means to be locked out by the people who are supposed to love you. I looked down at the Bible in my hands. The leather was cracked along the spine, dark, with years of oil from Margaret's fingers. She used to read from it every night before sleep, her lips moving silently over the words, the bedside lamp casting a warm circle around her, like a halo she didn't know she was wearing. I opened it carefully, turning the thin pages with fingers that trembled from more than just the cold. And there, tucked between the pages of Psalms, I saw the edge of something, a slip of paper, folded once, written in handwriting I would recognize anywhere on earth. But my eyes were blurred from the cold and the sleepless night, and the barn light was too weak to make out the words. I closed the Bible and held it on my lap, and I made myself wait. Whatever Margaret had hidden for me had waited this long. It could wait until my hands stopped shaking. Instead, I sat there in the gray morning light, and I let the memories come. I brought Margaret to this farm for the first time in the summer of 1976. We were both 20 years old, just married 3 weeks, driving up from Burlington in a pickup truck that burned oil and had no air conditioning. She wore a yellow sundress, and her hair was tied back with a ribbon that kept coming loose in the wind. My father was still alive then, standing on the porch with his arms crossed the way. Whitfield men have always stood on that porch, surveying the land like sea captains surveying the horizon. He was the third generation. His father had cleared the original timber in 1921, pulling stumps with a team of draft horses, turning wild Vermont hillside into pasture 1 acre at a time. By the time my father took over, the farm was 60 acres. By the time he handed it to me, we were down to 12. The rest sold off during hard years to pay taxes and veterinary school tuition. But those 12 acres were the heart of it. The original homestead, the land my grandfather had chosen because of the way the morning light hit the east meadow and the way the creek ran clean and cold through the bottom pasture all year long. Margaret stepped out of that truck and stood in the yard, turning slowly, taking it all in. The house with its peeling white paint, the barn with its sagging roof, the fields stretching toward the ridge, green and gold in the summer light. "It's not much," I said, because I was 20 and embarrassed by things that didn't need embarrassment. She looked at me with those eyes, the ones that always saw more than what was in front of her. "George Whitfield," she said, "this is the most beautiful place I've ever seen, and we're going to make it ours." She meant it. Every word. Over the next 44 years, Margaret poured herself into that land, the way rain pours into soil, quietly, steadily, changing everything it touches. She planted the garden first, the spring after we moved in. Coneflowers and asters along the fence line, black-eyed Susans by the mailbox, and sunflowers, always sunflowers, tall and golden, lining the path from the house to the barn like sentries made of light. "A farm without flowers is just a factory," she told me once. Her hands deep in the dirt, soil under her fingernails, sweat on her forehead, smiling like she'd discovered the secret to everything. "The animals need beauty too. So do we." She taught at the elementary school in Millbrook for 31 years. 3rd grade. Every child in this county, who's under 50, learned to read in Margaret Whitfield's classroom. She organized the church food drive every Thanksgiving, ran the summer reading program at the library, sat on the town planning board for 12 years. She was the kind of woman who made a community stronger just by being part of it. And she loved this land with a fierceness that still surprises me. Not the way a person loves a possession, but the way a person loves a living thing. She talked to the soil when she planted. She named every cow in the herd. She knew which birds nested in which trees and when the first frost would hit the garden within a day or two, every single year. We raised Ryan here. He was born in the upstairs bedroom during a snowstorm in 1984. Because the roads were too icy for the ambulance, and Margaret refused to panic. "Whitfields are born on Whitfield land," she said through gritted teeth, gripping my hand so hard I thought she'd break my fingers. That's how it's always been. Ryan grew up running through these fields, climbing the maples, helping me with the animals before school every morning. He could milk a cow by the time he was 8. He could drive the tractor by 12. He loved this place. Or at least I thought he did. The way children love the ground they grow up on, without thinking about it, without knowing it could ever be taken away. Margaret got sick in the spring 2 years ago. A stroke, sudden and cruel. The kind that steals a person in stages. First, the left side went. Then the speech. Then the light behind her eyes, dimming like a lamp being turned down slowly. In the hospital, during one of her last clear moments, she gripped my hand the way she had when Ryan was born. Fierce and unbreakable. Her voice was barely a whisper, but every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Promise me, George," she said. "Promise me you'll never let anyone take this land. Not even family." I promised. I promised because she asked me to, and because I meant it, and because I had no idea how hard that promise would be to keep. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, with the windows open and the smell of her garden drifting in on the breeze. I held her hand until it went cool. And then I held it a little longer, because letting go meant admitting that the strongest person I'd ever known was gone. Now I sat in her barn, holding her Bible, 18 months later, and I could still feel the ghost of her grip on my fingers. The light had grown stronger through the cracks in the boards, strong enough, finally, to read by. I opened the Bible again, turned to the page in Psalms where I'd seen the slip of paper, and pulled it out with careful fingers. Margaret's handwriting, small and steady, filled one side of the paper, a phone number, and beneath it, 7 words. "When they try to take the land, Call. I read it 3 times. Each time, the words sank deeper, like roots finding water. Margaret had known. She had seen what was coming before I ever did. She had planted this note the way she planted everything. With patience, with purpose, with absolute faith that it would bloom exactly when it needed to. I folded the paper and tucked it into my shirt pocket close to my heart. I was not ready to call. Not yet. But I was ready to stop sitting in the dark. I read Margaret's note 3 more times before I folded it and slipped it back into my shirt pocket. A phone number and 7 words. Whoever this person was. Whatever Margaret had arranged. She had planted it, like a seed, buried deep, trusting the right season would come. But seeds need time, and I needed to understand how I'd ended up sleeping in my own barn before I could figure out what to do next. So let me go back. 18 months before that padlock appeared on my door. Because Brenda didn't arrive like a storm. She arrived like a slow frost. The kind that doesn't kill the garden overnight, but creeps in so gently you don't notice until the roots are already dead. Margaret had been gone 2 months when Ryan called. It was a Tuesday, early evening. The sky still light over the ridge. I was sitting on the porch in the chair Margaret and I used to share. Not doing anything. Just existing in the space where she used to be. The phone rang, and Ryan's voice came through thin and strained, like a wire pulled too tight. "Dad," he said. "I lost my job." He'd been working at an accounting firm in Boston for 11 years. Good salary, corner office. The kind of career Margaret and I used to brag about at church without trying to sound like we were bragging. But something had gone wrong. He didn't give me details, and I didn't push. That's not how Whitfield men talk. "Come home," I told him. "There's always room here." He arrived 3 days later with Brenda and a moving truck. I'd met her twice before. Once at the wedding in Boston, a small affair at City Hall that Margaret had cried over because she wanted a church ceremony. And once at Thanksgiving 2 years prior. Both times she'd been polite, quiet, the kind of woman who smiles at the right moments and says the right things without revealing anything real. She stepped out of the car and looked at the farm the same way Margaret had in 1976, turning slowly, taking it all in. But where Margaret's eyes had been full of wonder, Brenda's held something else. Something I couldn't name at the time. But looking back now, I'd call it arithmetic. She was counting, measuring, calculating the value of every acre, every structure, every square foot of land her eyes could reach. "What a lovely place," she said, squeezing my hand. "We're so grateful, Dad. We're going to help you take care of everything. You won't have to do it alone anymore." I believed her. God help me. I believed her because I wanted to. Because the house was too quiet without Margaret. Because the sound of footsteps in the hallway and voices in the kitchen made the emptiness bearable. For the first few weeks, it almost worked. Ryan helped with the morning chores, feeding Bessie and the herd, checking the fences, hauling firewood. Brenda cooked dinner every evening. Nothing fancy, but warm and filling. And the kitchen smelled like food again instead of dust and grief. But small things started to shift. Little changes so gradual I almost missed them. The way you almost miss the first yellow leaf on a green tree. Brenda rearranged the living room furniture. Margaret's reading chair, the one by the window where she used to sit with her Bible in the evening light, was moved to the basement. "It doesn't match the room," Brenda explained when I asked. "We need to modernize a little, don't you think?" She took down Margaret's photographs from the hallway and replaced them with framed prints she'd ordered online. Abstract shapes in gray and white, where my wife's face used to be. "It looks cleaner this way," she said. Less cluttered. She started handling the mail, sorting it into piles, keeping certain envelopes, the ones from the bank, the ones from the county assessor, and sliding them into a drawer I never saw her open. When I asked about the property tax notice, she waved her hand like she was brushing away a fly. "Ryan and I are taking care of the finances now, George. You don't need to worry about that." Then came the animals. One morning in late summer, a livestock trailer pulled into the yard. Two men I'd never seen before stepped out with clipboards and started walking toward the herd. I was on the porch before they reached the first gate. "What's going on?" I asked. Brenda appeared beside me, her arm looped through Ryan's. "We've made a decision," she said, that patient voice again, the one wrapped in velvet with something sharp underneath. "The cattle are too expensive to maintain. Feed costs, vet bills, the fencing repairs. It doesn't make financial sense anymore." "Those are dairy cows," I said. "They pay for themselves, not according to the numbers." She held up a spreadsheet she'd printed, columns of figures I didn't have time to verify. "We've found a buyer. Fair price. It's already done." I looked at Ryan. My son, who had learned to milk those cows before he learned to ride a bicycle, who had named every calf born on this farm since he was 6 years old. He was looking at the ground, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Ryan," I said, "did you agree to this?" He didn't answer for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, without looking up. "It's for the best, Dad," he said, and the words sounded rehearsed, like lines learned from a script someone else had written. They loaded 12 cows into that trailer in under an hour. Bessie was supposed to go too, but she kicked the handler so hard he decided she wasn't worth the trouble. That old cow saved herself through pure stubbornness. The same stubbornness Margaret always said she loved about this land. I stood in the yard and watched the trailer pull away, dust rising behind it like smoke from something burning. 42 years of building a herd, generations of careful breeding, and midnight calvings and mornings so cold the milk froze in the pail. Gone in 60 minutes. That evening, after Ryan had gone to bed, I walked past the kitchen and heard Brenda's voice through the half-open door. She was on the phone, speaking quietly. But the old farmhouse carries sound the way rivers carry leaves, whether you want it to or not. 12 acres, she was saying, right on the edge of town. The zoning allows residential development. I checked. A pause. No, he doesn't suspect anything. He's just a sad old man who talks to his dead wife's chair. She laughed. A short, hard sound. Trust me. By the time he figures it out, it'll be done. I stood in the hallway, perfectly still, my hand against the wall Margaret had papered with blue wildflowers 30 years ago. And for the first time since she died, I heard her voice in my head, clear as the morning she made me promise. "Never let anyone take this land, George, not even family." I should have confronted her that night. I should have walked into that kitchen, taken the phone from her hand, and told her that this land would never be sold as long as I was breathing. But I didn't. I stood in the hallway with Margaret's words ringing in my ears. And I did what I'd been doing since Margaret died. I retreated to my room, closed the door, and told myself I must have misheard. That's the thing about betrayal that comes from family. You make excuses for it. Long after the evidence stops being circumstantial, you tell yourself, she didn't mean it that way. You tell yourself Ryan would never allow it. You tell yourself the person sleeping down the hall from you couldn't possibly be planning to take everything you love while you're too grief-blind to see it. Winter passed. The holidays were quiet and strange. Christmas dinner at a table where Margaret's empty chair sat like a wound no one would acknowledge. Brenda bought a new tablecloth, something gray and modern, and covered the oak surface Margaret had sanded and sealed herself. Ryan gave me a sweater I never wore. I gave them both gift cards because I no longer knew who my son was becoming, and I certainly didn't know his wife. Then spring came, and with it, the end of something I didn't know I was still holding on to. I heard the engine first. A low, grinding rumble that didn't belong to any machine on this farm. I was in the barn checking Bessie's hooves when the sound reached me, mechanical and merciless, the kind of noise that means something is being torn apart. I walked outside and saw the bulldozer. It was parked at the edge of Margaret's garden, a small yellow machine with a blade already lowered, its treads cutting dark wounds into the grass. A man in a hard hat sat in the cab, waiting. Brenda stood beside him with her arms crossed, pointing at the flower beds the way a general points at a position on a map that needs to be eliminated. "What is this?" I said. My voice came out hoarse. I hadn't spoken to anyone since the night before. Brenda turned and gave me that look. The patient one. The one I had come to understand was not patience at all, but performance. "We're clearing the lot, George. The surveying team needs clean access to measure the south boundary. Dead plants and overgrown beds just get in the way." Dead plants. She called them dead plants. I looked at the garden. Margaret's garden. 44 years of her hands in this soil, 44 springs of watching her kneel in the morning light, pressing seeds into the earth with her thumbs, talking to them the way she talked to everything she loved. Softly, encouragingly, as if she could will them into bloom. The coneflowers were just starting to open, pale purple heads nodding in the breeze. The black-eyed Susans hadn't sprouted yet. But they would. They always did. Faithful as sunrise. And the sunflowers. Margaret's sunflowers. The tall golden ones she planted every March along the path from the house to the barn. The ones she called her welcoming committee because they always turned their faces toward whoever was walking by. They were all still there. Still alive. Still blooming in the soil Margaret had tended like a prayer. "These aren't dead," I said. "Margaret planted these. Margaret's gone, George." Brenda said it flatly, the way you state a fact that has no emotional weight. Like saying it's Tuesday. Like saying the mail came, and the surveyor needs a clear line of sight. We can't let sentiment get in the way of progress. The man in the hard hat looked at me, then at Brenda, waiting for a signal. She nodded once. He shifted the machine into gear. I grabbed the fence. My fingers wrapped around the wooden post and held on as the blade dropped and the bulldozer lurched forward. The first row of coneflowers disappeared under steel and dirt in less than 3 seconds. The sound was wet and final, like the snapping of something that was alive a moment ago and now wasn't. The machine moved through the garden in methodical rows. The black-eyed Susans were next, then the asters, then the wild daisies Margaret had transplanted from the meadow behind the church. Each pass of the blade erased another year of her work. Another season of her love pressed into the earth. When the bulldozer reached the sunflowers, I closed my eyes. I couldn't watch them fall. I just listened, standing there with my hands locked around the fence post, hearing the stalks snap one by one, and each snap sounded like a small bone breaking. It took less than 20 minutes. When I opened my eyes, the garden was gone. In its place was a rectangle of churned brown earth, flat and featureless, scraped clean of every root and petal and memory. The bulldozer backed away and the driver killed the engine. The silence that followed was louder than the machine had been. Brenda walked across the cleared ground without looking down. She was already on her phone, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth that still held the shape of Margaret's rose. "Yes, it's ready," she said. "You can send the team out tomorrow." I don't know how long I stood at that fence. Long enough for the sun to move across the sky, and the shadows to shift, and the breeze to carry the smell of torn earth and crushed stems to where I was standing. It smelled like a grave. That's the only way I can describe it. It smelled like something had been buried that should have been left alive. Ryan found me there at sunset. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched in that posture he'd adopted since Brenda took over. The posture of a man trying to take up less space in his own life. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry about the garden. Did you know?" He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked back and forth, the way it used to when he was a boy trying not to cry. "She said the surveyor needed the space. Did you try to stop her?" The silence between us stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. He shook his head, just barely, and walked back toward the house. Without another word, I stayed until the stars came out. Then I went to the barn and sat with Bessie and pressed my face into her warm flank and let the tears come. Not for myself, for Margaret. For every seed she'd pressed into that soil, with love and patience, and faith that something beautiful would grow. For the sunflowers that would never turn their faces toward the path again. 3 days later, the SUV arrived, black and polished, out of place on our dirt road the way a shark would be out of place in a creek. It pulled into the driveway and a man stepped out, tall gray suit, leather briefcase, the kind of shoes that had never touched mud before today. He carried a rolled tube of paper under one arm, the way architects carry blueprints. And when he smiled at me, his teeth were so white they looked manufactured. "Craig Sullivan," he said, extending his hand. "Vice President of Crestview Developments. You must be Mr. Whitfield." I shook his hand. Because that's what you do when someone offers, even when every instinct tells you to pull away. His grip was firm but practiced, the handshake of a man who sees every person as a potential transaction. "Beautiful piece of land," he said, looking past me at the fields, at the ridge, at the cleared rectangle where Margaret's garden used to be. "Shame to waste it on a few cows." I looked at my hand, the one that had just shaken his. Then I looked at the ground where Margaret's sunflowers had stood 3 days ago. Both felt empty in exactly the same way. Brenda invited Craig inside like she owned the place. She held the door open with one hand, gestured toward the kitchen with the other, and said, "Come in. We've been expecting you." She used the word "we," as if I had agreed to something, as if my name had been on an invitation I never saw. Craig Sullivan walked through the hallway my father had paneled by hand, past the spot where Margaret's photographs used to hang, into the kitchen, where the walls still held the faintest ghost of yellow beneath the gray paint Brenda had rolled over them in November. He set his briefcase on the counter and pulled the rolled tube of paper from under his arm. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the dining table. "Of course," Brenda said. I watched him unroll the blueprints across the oak surface. Margaret's table. The table she had sanded smooth over 3 weekends. Stained with a walnut finish she mixed herself. Sealed with 4 coats of polyurethane because she wanted it to last 100 years. The table where she served Thanksgiving dinner for 43 consecutive years. Where Ryan had done his homework every evening, from first grade through high school. Where Margaret and I sat across from each other on 10,000 ordinary mornings, drinking coffee, reading the paper. Not saying much because after enough years together, love doesn't always need words. Now a stranger's blueprints were spread across it like a burial shroud. "Crestview Estates," Craig began, smoothing the paper with his manicured hands. 24 premium residences on 12 acres. Each lot is half an acre minimum, with shared amenities including a community pool, walking trails, and a 9-hole putting green. He pointed to the drawings as he spoke, tracing the roads and cul-de-sacs that would replace the pastures, the model homes that would rise where the hayfields stood. His voice had the practiced rhythm of a man who had given this speech 100 times, warm enough to sound human, smooth enough to sound trustworthy, empty enough to mean nothing at all. "And here," he said, tapping a spot on the map I recognized instantly, "we're proposing the community clubhouse. Central location. Great bones already. Great bones." He was talking about my house. The house my grandfather built. The house where my father was born. The house where Margaret died. I looked at the blueprints more carefully now, reading the small labels printed in neat black type beside each structure. Where the barn stood, the word "demolish" sat inside a small red rectangle, where Margaret's garden had been before the bulldozer took it. The label read "Visitor Parking." 42 spaces. The south pasture, where I'd delivered Bessie's first calf on a frozen January morning, was marked lots 17 through 24. Every acre had been assigned a purpose. Every inch of Whitfield land had been measured and valued and converted into a line on someone's profit sheet. 4 generations of living, reduced to a site plan. The projected return is significant, Craig continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Even after development costs, you're looking at a substantial payout, enough to set the family up very comfortably for a long time. He slid the folder toward the center of the table. Brenda picked it up before I could reach for it, opened it, and nodded, as if the numbers confirmed something she already knew. "We're ready to move forward," she said. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at Craig. And her smile was the widest I had ever seen it. The smile of a woman who could finally see the finish line. "No." The word came out of me like a stone dropping into still water. Simple. Heavy. Final. Craig blinked. Brenda's smile froze. Ryan, who had been standing by the refrigerator with his arms folded and his eyes on the floor, looked up for the first time since the meeting began. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations," I said, keeping my voice level despite the earthquake inside my chest. "My grandfather cleared it. My father farmed it. Margaret and I raised our son on it. It's not for sale." Craig opened his mouth to respond, but Brenda cut him off. She turned to face me fully, and the smile was gone now, replaced by something harder, something that had been hiding behind the patience and the velvet voice all along. "It's not your decision anymore, George." Her voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of someone who has been rehearsing this moment. "Ryan and I are the ones managing this property. We're the ones paying the bills. We're the ones planning for the future. And the future doesn't include a 70-year-old man sitting on 12 acres of prime real estate because he can't let go of the past." The room went silent. Craig looked from Brenda to me and back again. The discomfort of a man who recognizes he's walked into a family war and wants no part of the crossfire. He began rolling up the blueprints slowly, giving himself something to do with his hands. "Ryan," I said. Just his name. Just that one word. Asking him to be my son. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw something behind his eyes. A flicker. The ghost of the boy who used to hold my hand while we walked the fence line at sunset, who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from late-night calvings, who once told me at 12 years old that he never wanted to live anywhere else. Then Brenda put her hand on his shoulder, and the flicker died. "Dad," he said, "maybe we should talk about this later." There was no later. I knew that the way you know when the season has turned, not because anyone tells you, but because the air itself changes. Craig shook Brenda's hand at the door, murmured something about being in touch, and drove away. Brenda disappeared upstairs without looking at me. Ryan stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, opened his mouth, closed it again, and followed her. That night, I heard them talking through the bedroom wall. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough. "He'll come around," Brenda said. "And if he doesn't, we'll go around him." 3 days later, the padlock appeared on my front door. Now I was back in the barn, the circle complete. The flashback ended. Sitting on the same hay bale with Bessie chewing her cud beside me and Margaret's Bible heavy in my hands. The October wind pushed through the cracks and found the back of my neck, cold and persistent, like a reminder that time wasn't going to wait for me to be ready. I pulled the slip of paper from my shirt pocket and read Margaret's 7 words one more time in the thin morning light. When they try to take the land, call. They were trying. They had been trying for months, and I had done nothing but stand by the fence and watch. Maybe it's time, I thought. But before I could call the number Margaret had left, I needed to find someone. Someone she had trusted. Someone who might know more than I did about whatever my wife had planned. I knew exactly where to start. 7 miles down the mountain road, past the covered bridge and the old creamery, lived the only man in this county I trusted as much as Margaret did. Doc Wheeler hadn't changed his phone number in 30 years. But I wasn't going to call. Some conversations need to happen face to face. I pulled on my boots, zipped my jacket, and stepped into the cold Vermont morning. The fog was so thick that morning I could barely see the mailbox at the end of the drive. Vermont fog in October is not like mist. It is a living thing, heavy and cold, pressing against your skin like wet wool, swallowing the ridgeline and the tree line and the fences until the whole world shrinks to 10 feet in every direction. You walk through it, and the ground disappears behind you as fast as it appears in front of you. And after a while it starts to feel like you're not walking at all, but standing still while the earth moves beneath your boots. I turned left at the road and headed north, following the gravel shoulder by memory more than sight. 7 miles to Doc Wheeler's place. I hadn't walked it in years, not since my truck was running fine and my knees didn't argue with every step. But Brenda had the keys to the truck now, same as she had the keys to everything else. And I wasn't about to ask permission to drive my own vehicle to visit my own friend. The road followed the creek for the first 2 miles, crossing it once at the covered bridge where Margaret and I used to park on summer evenings and watch the water catch the last of the daylight. The bridge was built in 1894. Red cedar planks worn smooth by a century of horses and wagons and pickup trucks. Margaret used to say it was the most romantic spot in the county. I used to tell her she was biased because I proposed to her there, standing on those old planks with a ring I'd bought with 3 months of savings from my first year of veterinary practice. She said yes before I finished the question. That was Margaret. Always 3 steps ahead. Past the bridge, the road climbed through a stretch of maple forest that blazed red and orange in the fall. The leaves were past peak now, most of them already on the ground, but the ones that remained caught the thin light filtering through the fog and glowed like embers in a dying fire. My boots crunched through the fallen ones, and the sound was steady and rhythmic, almost musical. The percussion of a man putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping was not an option. I thought about Doc Wheeler as I walked. We had known each other for 41 years. Since the day I showed up at his clinic, as a 29-year-old fresh out of veterinary school with a borrowed stethoscope and more confidence than competence. Doc was already a legend in the county by then. A big, quiet man with hands like shovels and a voice so calm it could settle a panicking horse from across a barn. He took me on as a partner without an interview. Just looked at my diploma, looked at my hands, and said, "You'll do. Be here at 5 tomorrow morning. The Hendersons have a mare about to foal, and she's not going to wait for you to eat breakfast." For the next 30 years, we drove these roads together. Through blizzards that buried the fences, and heat waves that dried the creeks to dust. Through midnight calvings and early morning emergencies, and long quiet afternoons, when the only sounds were tires on gravel and the scanner crackling with weather reports. We didn't talk much during those drives. Doc wasn't a talking man, and I learned early that the best conversations between friends are the ones that don't need words. He taught me everything that school couldn't. How to read a sick animal's eyes. How to tell the difference between a farmer who's worried and a farmer who's lying. How to deliver bad news, the kind of news that means a family is about to lose their best milking cow or their children's favorite horse, without making it worse than it already is. "The animal is your patient," he told me once, during a long drive home from a difficult call. "But the farmer is your responsibility. Remember that, George. We don't just heal animals. We hold families together." I held those words close for 42 years. They shaped the way I practiced, the way I lived, the way I raised my son. Every late-night house call, every bill I didn't send because a family couldn't afford it. Every hour spent sitting in a barn with a farmer who just needed someone to be there while they grieved. It all came back to what Doc taught me that afternoon on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere. He retired 8 years ago. Moved to a smaller place 5 miles north of the farm. A 10-acre spread with a vegetable garden and a workshop where he built furniture nobody asked him to build. Margaret used to visit him every Wednesday, bringing soup or pie or whatever she'd baked that morning. After she died, I kept meaning to go see him. But the weeks turned to months, and the months turned to a year and a half. And somehow, I never made the drive. Shame does that. It convinces you that the people who care about you don't want to hear about the mess you've made of your life. It tells you to handle it yourself, to be strong, to not burden anyone else with your problems. Shame is a liar, but it's a convincing one. The fog began to thin as I climbed the last hill before Doc's property. The sun was trying to break through, turning the mist from gray to gold, and I could see the outline of his house taking shape ahead. The red barn, the stone wall he'd built along the driveway, the workshop with its chimney already trailing smoke. He was on the porch. Of course he was. Doc Wheeler had been waking up before dawn every day of his life for 74 years. And retirement hadn't changed that. He was sitting in a wooden rocker, a mug of coffee in one hand, a book in the other, looking out at the morning like a man who had made peace with the world and was just waiting to see what it would do next. He saw me coming up the road. I watched him set down the book and the coffee, watched him stand slowly, his big frame unfolding from the chair with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had opinions about cold mornings. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just stood there on the porch, his hands at his sides, watching me walk the last 100 yards with the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. My legs ached. My back was stiff. My hands were red and numb from the cold. I had walked 7 miles through Vermont fog with nothing but a Bible and a slip of paper and the stubborn refusal to give up that Doc himself had taught me all those years ago. "Morning, Doc," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the bag on my shoulder, the Bible under my arm, the mud on my boots, and the expression on my face. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't ask why I looked like a man who'd been sleeping in a barn, which I suppose was obvious enough. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's on." He held the door open, and as I stepped past him into the warmth of his kitchen, he put a hand on my shoulder, brief and firm, the touch of a man who says more with his hands than most people say with 100 words. "I've been expecting you, George," he said quietly. "Margaret told me you'd come." Doc Wheeler's kitchen smelled like coffee and pine smoke and something underneath that I couldn't name but recognized. It smelled like safety, like the kind of warmth that doesn't come from a stove but from being in a place where you are known completely and accepted anyway. He poured me a cup without asking. Black, no sugar. Same as it had been since the first morning he handed me a thermos in his truck 41 years ago. The mug was heavy ceramic, chipped at the rim. The kind you keep because it fits your hand in a way nothing else does. I wrapped both hands around it and let the heat soak in. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Doc sat across from me, his eyes steady on my face with the quiet focus of a man reading something more complicated than words. "Tell me," he said. So I told him everything. The way Brenda arrived with promises and turned them into demands, the photographs taken down, the furniture replaced, the mail intercepted, the finances rearranged, the cattle sold, 12 cows loaded into a stranger's trailer while I watched. Margaret's garden bulldozed flat. Craig Sullivan spreading blueprints across Margaret's table, labeling the barn demolish and the garden parking lot and the house clubhouse. I told him about the padlock and the garbage bag and Ryan behind the curtain, about sleeping in the barn with Bessie. While Brenda slept in the bedroom, Margaret died in. Doc listened without interrupting, without reacting. That was his gift. Not sympathy, which is easy, but attention, which is rare. He heard every word the way he used to listen to a sick animal's breathing, waiting for the detail that would tell him what was really wrong. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet, except for the stove ticking and the wind in the chimney. "You're not surprised," I said. Doc shook his head. "No. How long have you known?" He refilled my mug before answering, his movements unhurried, deliberate. "Margaret came to see me 3 months before she died. She drove over on a Wednesday. Same day she always visited, but she didn't bring soup. She brought a folder." He sat back down and folded his hands on the table. "She was already sick. She knew what was coming. Not just the stroke. Everything. She told me about Brenda, about the way she watched the house, the way she talked about the land when she thought no one was listening. Margaret said she'd seen it building for years, but she couldn't say anything to you because you wouldn't believe it. Not about Ryan's wife. Not while you still thought your son could be the man you raised." The words landed in my chest one by one. Margaret had been carrying this alone. Watching, worrying, planning. While her body failed and her time ran out, she asked me two things. Doc continued. First, to be here for you when things got bad. She said you'd walk through that door one day looking exactly the way you look right now, and I should be ready. Something shifted in his eyes, a softness I had seen only a handful of times in 4 decades. Second, she gave me this. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a slip of paper, folded once, small enough to fit in a closed palm. He set it on the table and slid it toward me. I unfolded it. Margaret's handwriting. Same blue ink. Same careful lettering. Same slight upward slant she always had when writing something that mattered. A phone number. And beneath it, a name. Alma Gutierrez. I reached into my own pocket and pulled out the slip from the Bible. Laid them side by side on Doc's kitchen table. Same number. Same name. Same handwriting. 2 identical notes. Hidden in 2 different places. Entrusted to 2 different hands. Margaret had planted the same seed twice, making certain that no matter which path I took, I would end up at the same destination. She left one in her Bible too, I said. Doc nodded. That sounds like Margaret. She never trusted anything to a single plan. Who is Alma Gutierrez? He leaned back and crossed his arms. A lawyer. Land and conservation law. Out of Burlington. Margaret found her on her own. I never met the woman. But Margaret said she was exactly the right person for what needed to be done. What needed to be done, I repeated. Doc looked at me steadily. Margaret said something that day I've never forgotten. She was standing right where you're sitting, holding her coffee the same way, and she looked at me and said, "The land is already safe, Doc. George just doesn't know it yet. The land is already safe." I turned the words over in my mind the way you turn a key in an unfamiliar lock, feeling for the click. Margaret had done something. While I was holding her hand and reading to her from the Bible, she'd hidden this note inside. While I was making soup she couldn't eat, she had been fighting a war I didn't know was coming. She didn't tell me what she'd done, Doc said. She said that was between you and Alma. But she was calm that day, the kind of calm that comes from knowing the foundation is solid, even if the storm hasn't arrived yet. I pressed both palms flat on the table and looked at the 2 slips of paper. 2 roads to the same place. 2 seeds in 2 gardens, planted by a woman who knew her season for growing was running out. She always was 3 steps ahead, I said. Doc's mouth curved into the smallest smile. At least 3. That night I lay on his couch under a quilt that smelled like cedar and wood smoke. The 2 slips of paper sat on the coffee table in the thin moonlight. I thought about Margaret standing in this kitchen 3 months before she died, sick and fierce, handing Doc a phone number like a soldier handing a comrade a map to safety. She could have told me everything. She could have sat me down and explained the danger, but she knew I wouldn't have believed her. Not then. Not while I still saw the best in my son and his wife. So she planted seeds instead. Quiet ones. Hidden ones. The kind that survive underground, through the hardest winter, and push through the soil, only when the warmth comes. What did you do, Margaret? I whispered to the dark ceiling. What did you do to save us? The house creaked. An owl called once outside and went silent. I lay there holding 2 pieces of paper my dead wife had written with her own weakening hand. And I felt something I hadn't felt since the padlock appeared on my door. I felt the ground beneath me. Solid. Unmoved. Still mine. 2 days I stayed at Doc's place. Coffee on the porch, silence that didn't need filling. The slow work of letting my body remember rest. But on the 2nd night, I couldn't sleep. Something pulled me back to the farm. A need I couldn't name. Like a rope tied to the center of my chest, my veterinary bag. 42 years of tools and instruments I'd carried on 10,000 house calls. It was still in the barn, on the shelf above the workbench. Brenda had thrown out my clothes and books, but she wouldn't have touched the bag. She wouldn't have known what it was. I borrowed Doc's truck and drove back in the dark. No headlights for the last quarter mile. I killed the engine at the bottom of the hill and walked the rest on foot, staying in the tree-lined shadows, moving the way I'd learned around skittish animals. Slow, deliberate, silent. The house was dark. The October moon hung full over the ridge, casting silver light that made familiar things look like photographs of themselves. I crossed the yard toward the barn, keeping to the grass. The door was unlocked. I found the bag on its shelf, slung it over my shoulder. Bessie shifted in her stall, but made no sound. Good girl. I should have left then. Straight back to the truck. Back to Doc's. But stepping out of the barn, something pulled my eyes toward the south side of the house, toward the rectangle of bare earth where Margaret's garden used to be. I stopped. The moonlight was bright enough to see colors. Purple, yellow, gold, shapes that shouldn't have been there, growing where nothing should grow, not after the bulldozer scraped that ground to raw dirt 6 months ago. I walked closer, heart beating faster than it should. Coneflowers, purple heads nodding in the night breeze. Black-eyed Susans, clusters of gold pressed close to the earth. And along the path where Margaret's welcoming committee used to stand, a row of young sunflower stalks, barely a foot tall, their leaves spread wide like small hands reaching for a moon they'd mistaken for the sun. Someone had replanted Margaret's garden, every flower in the right place. Every row following the same pattern Margaret kept. For 44 years. Precise, as if whoever did this had memorized the layout the way a musician memorizes a song, note by note, so deeply embedded it couldn't be forgotten. I knelt and touched a coneflower with my fingertip. Real. Alive. I pressed my palm against the earth and felt dampness from recent watering, the looseness of soil turned by hands that knew what they were doing. Grandpa. The whisper came from behind the garden shed. I turned and saw her step from the shadows. Small and serious, dark hair in a ponytail, hands and knees stained with dirt. Rosie, 10 years old, barefoot on cold ground, looking at me with eyes that held no fear. Only a steady certainty. Too old for her face. What are you doing out here? I breathed. She walked toward me through the moonlit rows, feet careful between the plants, stepping exactly where the gaps were. Grandma told me to never let the garden die, Grandpa. Every word carried the weight of a promise kept. She taught me where everything goes. Coneflowers by the fence, Susans by the mailbox, sunflowers along the path. She made me memorize it. Something cracked open in my chest. Not the painful kind. The other kind. The kind that happens when a seed splits its shell and the first green shoot pushes toward light. When did you do this? Every night after Mom goes to sleep. I work for an hour. Sometimes 2. I water before sunrise, so the ground dries before she wakes up. She looked at the garden with an expression I recognized. The same fierce tenderness Margaret wore every spring when the first shoots appeared. Mom thinks the rain did it. She doesn't come out here. She doesn't care about dirt. I sat down on the ground beside my granddaughter. Right there in the soil. This child had been waging her own private war against erasure. Night after night, while her mother slept. She knelt in this earth and pushed life back into ground where death had been poured. Grandma told me secrets, Grandpa. Lots of them. Rosie reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft from handling. She gave me this, said to keep it until you needed it. I unfolded it in the moonlight. Margaret's handwriting, weaker than the notes in the Bible in Doc's kitchen, but unmistakably hers. My dearest Rosie, you are the bravest person in this family. Even if no one knows it yet. Take care of Grandpa's garden when I'm gone. And when Grandpa comes to the garden at night, tell him I'm still here. In every flower, in every root, in every inch of this land. I read it twice. The second time the words blurred because my eyes were full, and the night was full of a presence I could feel but couldn't see, as real as the dirt beneath my knees. Headlights swept across the yard. An engine growled up the driveway. Rosie's head snapped toward the sound. Mom. She's back early. She grabbed my hand. small fingers gripping with surprising strength. "Go, Grandpa. I'll be okay." She doesn't know about the garden. Her eyes locked on mine. "Promise me you'll save our land." "I promise," I said. And the words tasted like Margaret's voice. I slipped into the barn shadow as headlights washed over the yard. Through the gap between boards, I watched Rosie disappear around the back of the house, quick and silent. A ghost in a garden that refused to die. I reached Doc's truck with the bag on my shoulder and Margaret's letter to Rosie pressed against my heart beside the 2 slips already there. 3 letters now. 3 seeds planted by the same hands. Bible, kitchen table, garden shed. Each hidden in a different corner of our lives. Each waiting for the season to turn. Margaret hadn't just prepared for this fight. She had recruited an army, a retired veterinarian who knew how to wait, a lawyer I hadn't met yet, and a 10-year-old girl with dirt under her fingernails and her grandmother's courage beating in her chest. I drove back to Doc's in the dark, and for the first time since the padlock appeared on my door, I knew exactly what I had to do. Morning would come, and with it, a phone call that was 2 years overdue. I dialed the number at 7 o'clock Monday morning, standing in Doc's kitchen with the slip of paper in one hand and the phone in the other. My fingers were steady. Whatever shaking I'd done in the past week had burned itself out, replaced by something quieter and harder, the stillness that comes after you've made a decision and there's nothing left but follow through. The phone rang once. Halfway through the second ring, a woman answered. Clear and direct. "This is Alma Gutierrez. My name is George Whitfield." "I think my wife." "Margaret," she said. And the way she spoke that name stopped me. Not like a stranger reading a file. Like someone remembering a person who had mattered. "You must be George. I've been waiting for this call." The words echoed Doc's from 2 days before. I've been waiting. As if Margaret had written a script for the people she loved, and they were all playing their parts on cue. "Can we meet?" I asked. "Today. My office is in Burlington." "How soon can you be here?" Doc drove. I sat in the passenger seat with 3 letters in my pocket and the Bible on my lap, watching Vermont scroll past the window. The maples were bare, branches dark against pale sky, but the evergreens held steady on the ridgelines, rooted in something deeper than weather. Alma's office was on the 3rd floor of a converted mill building near the waterfront. She opened the door before I knocked, smaller than I expected. 5'3", dark hair shot through with silver, brown eyes that assessed me in a single glance, the way Doc assessed a sick animal. Quick, thorough, missing nothing. "George," she said, shaking my hand. "And you must be Doc Wheeler. Margaret mentioned you." "She mentioned everyone, apparently," Doc said. And Alma smiled. She was thorough. "Please, sit down." Her office was small but precise. Every surface covered with files and maps arranged with the care of someone who understood that details were the difference between winning and losing. A large map of Vermont covered one wall, dotted with colored pins. I noticed a red one near where our farm would be. Alma sat behind her desk and folded her hands. She looked at me the way people look when they're about to change your life. And they know it. Margaret came to me 2 years before she passed. She'd done her research. She knew exactly what she wanted and why. In 30 years of practice, I've never had a client more prepared. She opened a drawer, pulled out a thick folder, and laid it between us. "Your wife was worried about the land. Not the work, not the upkeep. She was worried about what would happen after she was gone. She told me about Brenda, about conversations she'd overheard. Margaret had overheard too. Just like me in the hallway, listening to words not meant for her ears. She asked about legal protections, ways to ensure the land could never be sold for commercial development, no matter who held the deed. I told her about conservation easements. She turned the folder so I could read the top page. Vermont Land Trust Conservation Easement Agreement. Below the header, in the space marked grantor, Margaret's name in her own hand. A conservation easement permanently restricts land use to protect its conservation value. Your 12 acres are now legally protected from residential or commercial development. Forever. The easement attaches to the deed, not the owner. It doesn't matter who owns or inherits the land. The restriction follows the property in perpetuity. I stared at the document. Margaret's signature at the bottom, steady and sure. The same handwriting from 44 years of grocery lists and love notes. Beside it, a notary seal and a date, 2 years before she died. 6 months before the first symptom. She planned this before she got sick, I said. Alma nodded. She came in perfect health. She wasn't reacting to a crisis. She was preventing one. She turned pages slowly. Boundaries matching exactly 12 acres. Permitted uses. Agriculture. Conservation. Wildlife habitat. Education. Prohibited. No subdivision. No commercial development. No new residential construction. Any contract with a developer is void on its face. The easement predates anything Brenda could have signed. It's registered with the state, recorded with the county. There is no legal mechanism to override, challenge, or undo it. Doc let out a long breath. I couldn't look at him. I was staring at Margaret's signature. The careful loops of her M, the confident line of her W. Written by a hand still strong, still sure, still fighting for this land years before the battle reached the door. Alma pulled a single sheet from the folder. Margaret's handwriting again, not a legal document this time. A note scrawled in the margin of the easement map, beside a small sketch of the farm drawn from memory. Every acre matters. Every memory is worth protecting. I pressed my fingers against the words and felt the indentation of her pen. The physical proof that she had sat in this office and pressed these letters into paper with her own living hand. There's one more thing, George. Alma's voice softened. She reached into the drawer and produced a cream-colored envelope, sealed, my name across the front in Margaret's writing. She left this with me. Said to give it to you after you understood what she'd done. She set it on the desk. I looked at it but didn't reach. My name in her hand. The last letter I would ever receive from the woman who spent her final years building walls around everything we loved. I'm not ready, I said. Alma nodded. She said you might not be. She told me to say there's no rush. The land is safe. The letter will wait. Doc put his hand on my shoulder. I covered his hand with mine and held on. Through the window, Lake Champlain stretched silver toward the horizon. Margaret had sat in this chair. She had looked at this water, and she had done what she always did. Thought 3 steps ahead, planted seeds in every garden she could reach, and trusted the right hands would find them. Thank you, I said to Alma, for keeping your promise to her. Alma's eyes glistened, but her voice held steady. Margaret was easy to make promises to. She was the kind of woman who made you want to keep them. The letter didn't wait. We were 20 minutes out of Burlington, Doc's truck rattling along the county road with the heater blowing warm air that smelled like old upholstery. When I pulled the envelope from my jacket pocket, I hadn't planned to open it yet, but my hands moved on their own, the way they sometimes did during difficult deliveries, when instinct took over and thinking got out of the way. Pull over, I said. Doc glanced at me, then at the envelope, and eased the truck onto the shoulder without a word. We stopped beside a stand of white birch, their pale trunks glowing against the dark pines behind them. The engine ticked as it cooled. A hawk circled high above the tree line, riding a current I couldn't feel. I slid my finger under the flap and broke the seal. The paper inside was cream-colored. 2 sheets, folded into thirds. Margaret's handwriting covered both sides, smaller than usual, as if she'd had more to say than the paper would hold. The letters slanted upward the way they always did when she was writing something important, leaning toward the future even as her hand moved across the present. My dearest George, she began. I had to stop after those 3 words. Not because they were surprising, but because they were so perfectly, so completely her. My dearest. She had called me that since our second date, when I'd brought her wildflowers I'd picked from the side of the road, and she'd laughed and said, "My dearest George, those are weeds." And I'd said, "Only if you don't put them in water." And she'd put them in water and kept them until they turned brown. And after that, I was always her dearest. I breathed. I read. If you're reading this, then Alma has told you what I've done. And you're probably sitting somewhere trying to understand why I didn't tell you myself. The answer is simple and painful. And I'm sorry for it. I didn't tell you because you wouldn't have believed me. Not about Ryan. Not about Brenda. You see the best in people, George. It's your greatest gift. And your most dangerous blind spot. She was right. She had always been right about the things I couldn't see. I watched Brenda for 3 years before I acted. I saw the way she looked at the house. Not with love, but with arithmetic. I heard the things she said when she thought I was napping or out in the garden. She measured our home the way a butcher measures a carcass. By the pound. By what each piece would fetch at market. The words were precise, unflinching. Margaret had never been one to soften the truth when the truth needed to cut. I knew what she would do. She would start small, the things that belonged to me. My photographs, my furniture, my presence in the daily life of the house. Then she would move to the land, the animals first, because they cost money. Then the garden, because it took space. Then the house itself, because that's where the real value lives. And finally you, George. She would try to remove you, because you're the only thing standing between her and the deed. I read the next lines 3 times, each time feeling them sink deeper. She'll sell the animals first, then the garden. Then she'll invite strangers to measure our land like it's merchandise. And somewhere along the way, she'll convince Ryan that none of this is his fault, that he's doing the right thing, that letting go of the past is the same as moving forward. It's not. Letting go of the past is only moving forward when you're walking towards something better. What Brenda is walking toward is a check. Margaret had written this 2 years before she died. 2 years before the cattle trailer pulled into our driveway. 2 years before the bulldozer touched her garden. She had seen every move on the board before the first piece was played. So I built a wall she can't climb. The conservation easement is permanent. It's legal. It's done. No developer can touch our land. No court can undo it. No amount of Brenda's scheming can break it. Those 12 acres will stay exactly what they've always been. Farmland. Home. Ours. She shifted then. The way she always did in conversation. Moving from the practical to the personal. With a grace that made both feel like the same thing. This land isn't just dirt and grass, George. It's every sunrise we watched from the porch. Every calf you delivered in the dark. Every flower I planted, knowing it would bloom long after I was gone. It's Ryan's first steps in the kitchen. It's Rosie's laughter in the meadow. It's your grandfather's hands pulling stumps from hillside. And your father's voice calling the cows home at dusk. 4 generations of living are rooted in this soil, and roots that deep don't get pulled up by someone with a calculator and a real estate license. I was crying now. Not the held-back kind, not the kind you can hide by looking away. The kind that comes from somewhere below the ribs, from the place where love lives when it has nowhere else to go. Doc sat beside me, silent. His hands on the steering wheel, his eyes on the birch trees. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Some moments don't ask for witnesses. They ask for presence. The final page was shorter. The handwriting was steadier here, as if Margaret had found a calm place inside herself and written from there. I need to tell you something I should have said more often while I was alive. You were never weak, George. I know you think kindness is the same as softness. I know you believe that because you didn't fight back, because you didn't shout or threaten or slam your fist on the table, you somehow failed. You didn't. Kindness is not weakness. It is the strongest foundation I know. Every building starts with the ground it stands on, and you, my love, are the most solid ground I've ever known. She ended the way she ended everything. Simply. Without fanfare. With the quiet confidence of a woman who had said exactly what she meant and trusted it would be enough. Build something new on our old beautiful land. I'll be watching. I always am. All my love. Forever. And then some. Margaret. I folded the letter along its original creases and pressed it against my chest. The paper was warm from my hands. Through the windshield, the hawk was still circling, patient and unhurried, riding the invisible current above the trees. So, Doc said after a while. His voice was rough. He cleared his throat. What's the plan? I slid the letter into my shirt pocket, next to the 3 slips of paper already there. 4 pieces of Margaret now, pressed against my heart. There's a town meeting next Thursday, I said. Brenda and Crestview are presenting their project to the planning board. Doc looked at me. I looked at him. We're going to let them present, I said. And then we're going to end it. 7 days. That's what stood between me and the town meeting at Millbrook Hall. 7 days to turn 42 years of serving this community into a shield strong enough to protect the land beneath our feet. Alma worked from Burlington, calling twice a day with updates. She was assembling the legal presentation with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. Every document copied. Every statute cited. Every possible objection anticipated and answered before it could be raised. She told me she hadn't lost a land case in 14 years, and she said it not as a boast but as a fact. The same way Doc might say he'd never lost a patient to negligence. It was simply the standard she held herself to. When I stand up in that meeting, she said during our Tuesday call, there won't be a single question I can't answer. Margaret made sure of that. The woman practically built the case herself. That sounded exactly like Margaret. She never asked anyone to do a job she hadn't already half finished. While Alma sharpened the legal blade, Doc and I drove the back roads. Not to recruit, not to campaign, just to visit. That was Doc's idea, and it was the right one. You don't ask people for help, George, he said as we pulled out of his driveway on Wednesday morning. You remind them why they'd want to give it. We started at the Henderson place, 3 miles east on the Ridge Road. The farm had been in Martha Henderson's family almost as long as ours had been in mine, and Martha herself was 82 years old. Sharp as a fence nail, with opinions about everything and the volume to make sure you heard them. She met us on her porch with coffee already poured and a plate of biscuits that tasted exactly the way they'd tasted 20 years ago. She didn't ask why we'd come. Martha Henderson had lived long enough to know that when 2 old veterinarians show up unannounced on a Wednesday, something is either dying or being born. I told her about Crestview, about the blueprints and the bulldozer and the 24 luxury homes they wanted to plant where Whitfield cattle had grazed for a century. I didn't tell her about the easement. Not yet. That was for the meeting. Martha set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. I knew it, she said. I saw that black car going up your road last spring. Told Harold, rest his soul. I said those aren't folks buying eggs. She leaned forward. If they take Whitfield, George, they'll come for Henderson next. That's how these people work. One farm falls, and the rest follow like dominoes. She gripped my hand across the table. You tell me what you need, and I'll be there. Thursday night. Front row. From the Hendersons, we drove to the Morales place on the south side of the valley. Elena Morales was 56, ran a sheep operation with her 3 sons, and had the kind of handshake that made you check your fingers afterward. I'd saved her prize ram during a complicated breech delivery 8 years ago, spent the whole night in her barn with my arms shoulder-deep in trouble while her youngest boy held the lantern and tried not to faint. She remembered. Of course she remembered. Farmers remember the people who show up at 3 in the morning. That ram sired 40 lambs the next season, she said, pouring me cider in her kitchen. 40. Best year we ever had. And you wouldn't take a penny for it. You were having a hard year, I said. It didn't seem right. Elena shook her head. See, that's the thing about you, George. You never kept score. But other people did. She looked at Doc. Thursday? Thursday. Doc confirmed. The Kowalski farm was next. Then the Chens. Then the Bennetts. Each stop brought another kitchen, another cup of coffee, another story I'd half forgotten about late-night emergencies and early morning miracles. Tom Kowalski reminded me of the time I'd splinted his daughter's pony's leg with duct tape and a broomstick, because the proper supplies were an hour away, and the animal couldn't wait. Henry Chen told Doc about the afternoon I'd helped him pull a calf that was turned sideways, both of us covered in mud and blood, laughing like fools when the thing finally slid free and stood up on wobbly legs within 10 minutes. Each family said the same thing in different words. We'll be there. Thursday night. Just tell us when. I didn't ask them to fight for me. I didn't ask them to speak or protest or make signs. I just sat in their kitchens and drank their coffee and let 42 years of showing up do the talking. Doc had been right. You don't ask people for loyalty. You earn it one house call at a time, and when the season turns, it comes back to you like rain returning to the river that feeds the fields. By Saturday, word had spread the way it always does in small towns, not through announcements or newspapers, but through the invisible network of fences and front porches and phone calls that connects every farm to every other farm within a 20-mile radius. Crestview wanted to develop Whitfield land. George Whitfield was going to the town meeting. Something was about to happen. Thursday night. That was all anyone needed to know. The evening before the meeting, I sat on Doc's porch watching the last light fade behind the ridge. The air smelled like wood smoke and frost, the particular scent of Vermont in late October when the world is pulling inward, preparing itself for the long sleep ahead. My phone buzzed on the armrest. A text from a number I didn't recognize, but the voice behind the words was unmistakable. Grandpa, Mom is practicing her speech for tomorrow. She keeps saying words like investment and community growth and moving forward. She thinks she's going to win. I'll be there too. Love, Rosie. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and looked at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to show themselves through the thin clouds. I smiled. The first real smile in weeks. Not because the battle was won. It wasn't. Not yet. But because I was going into it with something Brenda would never understand. Something that couldn't be measured in acres or dollars or square footage. I was going in with 42 years of showing up. With a dead wife who fought from beyond the grave. With a granddaughter who grew flowers in the dark. With a friend who never once asked me to explain my pain. And with a lawyer in Burlington who had spent 2 weeks building a wall that no amount of money or ambition could climb. Tomorrow, I would walk into that meeting hall. And for the first time in 18 months, I would not be walking alone. The Whitfield Ridge Community Hall smelled the way it always did. Old pine, lemon polish, and decades of town arguments settled over folding chairs. I hadn't been inside since Margaret's memorial service. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The same American flag hung limp beside the state banner. The same crack ran across the ceiling above the podium. Nothing had changed, except everything. Doc Wheeler and I arrived 40 minutes early. He wore a clean flannel and his good boots, the ones he saved for funerals and town votes. I wore the brown corduroy jacket Margaret bought me the Christmas before her stroke. It still smelled faintly of her lavender hand cream if I pressed my nose to the collar. We sat in the last row, near the emergency exit. Alma had been clear. Sit in the back. Say nothing. Let them talk. Let them finish. Do not react. When the time comes, I will handle it. She was driving from Burlington and would arrive by 7:15. The meeting started at 7. By 6:50, the hall was nearly full. Whitfield Ridge was a small town, maybe 1,100 people, and most meetings drew 30 or 40. But tonight the chairs ran 8 rows deep, and people stood along the walls. I recognized almost every face. Martha Henderson sat in the 3rd row, clutching her purse like a weapon. Luis Morales leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed. The Kowalskis took up most of the second row: Frank, Ellen, and their 3 grown sons. Even old Mrs. Chen was there, wrapped in her green wool coat, her cane propped against her knee. Rosie was not in the room. I looked twice and felt a knot tighten below my ribs. At 7 o'clock, the side door opened and Brenda walked in. She wore a charcoal blazer, a cream blouse, and heels that clicked against the hardwood like a metronome. Her hair was pulled back. Her makeup was precise. She carried a leather portfolio and a confidence that did not belong to her. It belonged to the house she had stolen, the land she had never worked, and the family name she married into without understanding what it meant. Ryan followed 2 steps behind, wearing a tie and a face ironed flat. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at me. He looked at the floor, the way he always did when Brenda spoke, and he chose silence over his father. Craig Sullivan entered last. He carried rolled blueprints and a projector case. Navy suit, silver watch, easy smile. He set up the projector near the podium. The screen displayed the Crestview Developments logo, a stylized house inside a green circle, the word community printed underneath in a font designed to look handwritten. Brenda stepped to the podium first. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "I know many of you have questions about the Whitfield property. My husband and I have lived on the farm for 18 months, and we've had to make difficult decisions about the land's future." She paused, practiced. I could see the rehearsal in the tilt of her head, the way her fingers rested on the podium's edge. Maintaining a 12-acre property in today's economy is not sustainable. The barn needs a new roof. Property taxes have increased 31% over the last decade, and with my father-in-law's declining health, my jaw clenched. Doc put his hand on my forearm. I stayed seated. "We've partnered with Crestview Developments to explore a plan that benefits everyone." Craig took the podium. His voice was warm, practiced, and 2 degrees too friendly. "Good evening, folks. I'm Craig Sullivan, Vice President at Crestview Developments. We're a family-owned firm based in Montpelier, working with rural Vermont communities for 15 years. He clicked a button. The screen filled with a color-rendered aerial view of our 12 acres. Except, it wasn't our land anymore. It was a grid. 24 lots arranged in neat rows where pastures used to be. A clubhouse on the footprint of our farmhouse. The barn was gone. Margaret's garden was a parking lot with 42 numbered spaces. "Crestview Estates at Whitfield Ridge," Craig announced. He walked the room through the plan. Half-acre lots, energy-efficient homes, fiber-optic internet, a shared green space called the Meadow, occupying the strip between the creek and the eastern fence, where Margaret and I walked every evening. Underground utilities. Projected values: $420,000 per unit, generating $10.1 million total. He said it slowly. I watched the room. Some faces were blank. Some were calculating. Martha Henderson's knuckles went white around her purse. The final slide showed a smiling young family on green grass. Below it, building futures on solid ground. My grandfather's ground. My father's ground. Margaret's ground. Craig opened the floor for questions. Someone asked about water runoff. Someone asked about construction noise. Brenda answered with rehearsed statistics. Ryan sat in the front row with his hands folded, staring at the screen like a man watching his own sentencing. Doc leaned close. "Alma just texted. She's parking now." I looked at the clock. 7:14. The side door opened quietly. Alma Gutierrez walked in carrying a single brown folder, dark jacket, no jewelry, and an expression I had seen once before on Margaret's face. The morning she told me she had already taken care of everything. Alma sat beside me. She placed the folder on her lap, folded her hands over it, and said nothing. Brenda glanced toward the back. Our eyes met for half a second. She looked away. Then she looked back, and her smile flickered just once like a candle in a draft. It hadn't noticed yet. "Any other questions?" Craig asked. Alma leaned toward me and whispered 3 words. "Not yet." Almost. Craig Sullivan closed his laptop and smiled at the room like a man who had already won. Brenda stood beside him, arms folded, chin lifted. Ryan stared at the floor. The hall was quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights and the sound of Martha Henderson breathing hard through her nose. "If there are no further questions," Craig said, "we'd like to move forward with scheduling a community vote on the rezoning proposal. We believe this project—" "I have a question." Alma Gutierrez stood up from the last row. She held the brown folder against her chest with one hand and adjusted her jacket with the other. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the way a stone carries across still water, clean, direct, impossible to ignore. Every head in the room turned. Brenda's eyes narrowed. She leaned toward the microphone. "I'm sorry, and you are?" "Alma Gutierrez. Attorney at law, licensed in the state of Vermont. I specialize in land conservation and property rights." She paused. "I represent the legal interests of George Whitfield." The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your chest. Craig's smile dropped half an inch. Brenda's fingers tightened on the podium. Ryan looked up for the first time all evening. Alma walked forward. Not fast, not slow. She moved the way Margaret used to move through the garden, deliberate, purposeful. Every step placed with intention. She reached the front of the room and set the brown folder on the table beside Craig's laptop. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "before we discuss rezoning, I'd like to clarify a legal matter regarding the Whitfield property." Craig glanced at Brenda. Brenda glanced at Ryan. Ryan looked at me. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds, then looked away. I had nothing to say to him. Not yet. Alma opened the folder. On March 14th, 2 years before her passing, Margaret Whitfield filed a permanent conservation easement with the Vermont Land Trust covering the entirety of the 12-acre Whitfield property. She removed a document thick, notarized, bearing the state seal, and held it up for the room to see. This easement was recorded with the town clerk's office and is legally binding in perpetuity. She let the word sit. Perpetuity. It filled the room, the way sunlight fills a barn at dawn. Slow, complete, and irreversible. Under the terms of this easement, the Whitfield property cannot be subdivided, developed for residential or commercial use, or sold to any entity whose intended use conflicts with the conservation restrictions outlined in the agreement. Alma set the document on the table. In simple terms, no houses, no clubhouse, no parking lot, no Crestview Estates. Not now. Not ever. Martha Henderson made a sound. It might have been a laugh. It might have been a prayer. Frank Kowalski slapped his knee. Luis Morales uncrossed his arms and nodded once, slow and certain. Craig Sullivan picked up the document. He read the first page. He turned to the second. His face changed the way weather changes in Vermont fast, without warning and with consequences. He set the paper down and looked at Brenda. "Did you know about this?" Brenda's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She looked at Ryan. Ryan shook his head. This can't be real," Brenda said. Her voice cracked at the edges. "She never mentioned, we never saw. The easement was filed independently by Margaret Whitfield as the co-owner of the property," Alma said. "It does not require the knowledge or consent of any other family member. It is recorded, notarized, and enforceable under Vermont state law." Brenda grabbed the document from the table. She read it the way a drowning person reads, a lifeboat manual, desperate, scanning, looking for a loophole that was not there. Her hands trembled. The pages shook. "This is fraud," she whispered. You can't just..." "Mrs. Whitfield." Alma's voice was steady. "I drafted this easement myself. I filed it with the state. I watched Margaret sign it at my office in Burlington on a Tuesday afternoon. She brought wildflowers from her garden and put them in a jar on my desk. Alma paused. She told me this day would come. She asked me to be ready. Brenda dropped the document on the table. She turned to the room, searching for an ally, a sympathetic face, someone who would stand with her. She found none. Martha Henderson looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been waiting 18 months for this exact moment. The Kowalski sons sat with their arms folded like a wall. Mrs. Chen tapped her cane once against the floor, a small, deliberate sound that said everything. The development proposal is legally void. Alma continued. Any attempt to proceed will result in immediate injunctive relief and potential criminal liability for violations of state conservation law. Craig Sullivan closed his laptop. He picked up his blueprints. He did not roll them neatly. He folded them in half, tucked them under his arm, and walked toward the side door without looking at Brenda. Without looking at anyone. The door closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Brenda stood alone at the podium. Ryan had not moved from his chair. The room was silent. I could hear the October wind pressing against the windows, the same wind that bent the sunflowers in Margaret's garden, the same wind that carried her voice across the fields when she called me home for dinner. Alma turned to face the room. The Whitfield farm is protected. Permanently. If anyone has questions about the easement or its implications, I'll be available after the meeting. She walked back to the last row and sat beside me. She placed the folder on her lap again, folded her hands, and exhaled one long, slow breath that sounded like relief and victory and something Margaret might have called grace. Doc Wheeler put his hand on my shoulder. I felt the weight of it warm, steady, the hand of a man who had waited beside me through the longest season of my life. I looked at the podium. Brenda was gone. She had slipped out the side door after Craig, leaving Ryan alone in the front row. He sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I could not tell if he was crying or simply breaking apart the way old fences do when the posts finally rot through. Martha Henderson stood up. She turned to face me across 8 rows of folding chairs and 50 years of neighborly silence. She nodded once. That was all. One nod from a woman who understood land and loss, and what it cost to protect both. I pressed my hand against my jacket pocket. Margaret's letter crinkled softly against my chest. Her words echoed. Kindness is not weakness. It is the strongest foundation I know. The hall began to empty. People filed past me. Some touched my shoulder. Some shook my hand. Frank Kowalski gripped my palm and said, Your grandfather would be proud. Mrs. Chen paused, looked at me with those sharp, dark eyes, and whispered. Margaret knew. Yes, she did. I sat in the last row until the hall was empty. Doc waited beside me. Alma waited beside me. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The flag hung still. The crack in the ceiling ran diagonal, same as always. But tonight the ground beneath my feet felt different. It felt permanent. The morning after the town meeting, I woke on Doc Wheeler's couch to the sound of tires on gravel. 3 trucks, then a 4th, then a 5th. I pulled back the curtain and saw a line of vehicles stretching down Doc's driveway to the county road pickups, flatbeds, an old horse trailer, and Martha Henderson's green Subaru with a trunk full of something I couldn't identify from the window. Doc stood on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed me one without looking away from the driveway. Word travels fast in a small town, he said. By 8 o'clock, 14 people had gathered at the Whitfield farm. I rode with Doc in his truck, and when we turned onto the dirt road that led to the property, I saw them spread across the front yard like a congregation that had come to rebuild a church. Frank Kowalski and his 3 sons were unloading fence posts from a flatbed. Luis Morales carried a toolbox toward the barn. Martha Henderson stood near the porch with 2 younger women I recognized from the Methodist church, all 3 holding buckets of paint and rollers wrapped in plastic. I stepped out of the truck and stood there. The farm looked the same. The white clapboard house with the sagging porch, the red barn with its patched roof, the empty pasture where 12 dairy cows once grazed. But something was different. The air felt different. The land felt awake. Martha walked over. She wore work gloves and a flannel shirt rolled to her elbows. She looked at me the way she used to look at Margaret, direct, warm, no nonsense. "We're not asking permission, George. We're just here." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. She patted my arm and walked back to the porch. By noon, the Kowalski boys had replaced 32 fence posts along the eastern boundary. They worked in silence, driving each post with a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Steady, reliable, the kind of sound that means something is being repaired. Luis Morales and his nephew had patched the barn roof with new cedar shingles, the fresh wood bright against the weathered gray. Martha and her crew had scraped and primed the porch railing, and the front steps, which had been cracking since the winter before Margaret's stroke, were reinforced with new planks. I tried to help. Frank Kowalski handed me a hammer and pointed at the pasture gate, which had been hanging crooked for 2 years. I replaced the hinges. It took me 40 minutes. My hands were slower than they used to be, my grip weaker, but the gate swung true when I finished. And that was enough. Doc Wheeler worked beside me most of the day. He didn't talk much. He handed me nails when I needed them and held boards steady while I measured. At one point he looked at the barn and said, "Margaret would have had lemonade out by now." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in months, and the sound surprised me rough, rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a long time. Around 2 o'clock, a car I didn't recognize pulled up to the mailbox. A woman stepped out carrying a casserole dish. Then another car. Then a minivan. By 3 o'clock, the kitchen table, Margaret's oak table, the one Craig Sullivan had spread his blueprints across, was covered with food. Chicken pot pie from the Hendersons. Cornbread from Mrs. Chen. A slow cooker full of chili from someone whose name I never caught. Apple cake, wrapped in foil with a note that read, "From the Bennetts. Welcome home. Welcome home." 2 words. I read them 4 times. I ate standing up in the kitchen, looking out the window at the people moving across my land. They carried lumber and paint and tools, but what they really carried was something Margaret had spent 46 years building: a community that remembered, a community that showed up. Not because they owed me anything, but because this is what neighbors did when the fence posts rotted, and the barn roof leaked, and someone tried to pave over everything that mattered. Late in the afternoon, I walked to the back of the property. The garden was there, Rosie's garden, Margaret's garden, the one Brenda had bulldozed and my granddaughter had replanted in secret. The coneflowers stood purple and defiant. The black-eyed Susans caught the last of the October light. The sunflowers were small but upright, their heads turned east, waiting for tomorrow's sun. I knelt beside the sunflower row. The soil was dark and loose. I pressed my hand into it and felt the coolness against my palm, the weight of earth that had held 4 generations of roots. Margaret had planted the first sunflowers the summer we moved in. She said they were the only flowers stubborn enough to match a Whitfield. I heard footsteps behind me. Small footsteps. "Grandpa?" Rosie stood at the edge of the garden. She wore her school backpack and muddy sneakers. Her hair was pulled into a ponytail that was already coming undone. She looked at me with Margaret's eyes, dark brown, steady, older than her 10 years had any right to be. "Mom left this morning," she said quietly. "She packed 2 suitcases and drove to Aunt Karen's in Massachusetts. Dad's still at the house. He hasn't come out of the bedroom." I stood up. My knees protested. I brushed the dirt from my hands. "Are you okay?" I asked. She looked at the garden, at the coneflowers and the black-eyed Susans and the small sunflowers she had planted alone in the dark. "I saved the garden," she said. "Like Grandma told me to." "You did. Did we save the land too?" I looked past her at the farm, the mended fence, the patched barn, the freshly painted porch, the line of trucks in the driveway, the people who had come without being asked. I looked at the mountains beyond the pasture, blue and permanent against the October sky, and I thought about Margaret's letter and the word she had underlined twice: foundation. Yes, I said. We saved the land. Rosie dropped her backpack in the dirt and wrapped her arms around my waist. She pressed her face against my corduroy jacket and held on the way. Children hold on when they finally feel safe, tight, complete, and unwilling to let go. I put my hand on her head. Her hair smelled like autumn leaves and pencil shavings, and something that might have been hope, behind us. The garden grew. Rosie stayed with me that night. She slept in Margaret's reading chair, the one Brenda had moved to the basement, and Martha Henderson had carried back upstairs that afternoon. I covered her with the quilt Margaret's mother had sewn in 1961, the one with the faded blue stars and the patch on the corner where our old dog Chester had chewed through the fabric 20 years ago. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the house settle. The floorboards creaked the way they always did after a long day, wood expanding, contracting, breathing the way old houses breathe when they remember they are still alive. The kitchen smelled like cornbread and chili, and fresh paint from the porch railing. Through the window, I could see the barn, its new cedar shingles pale against the dark roof like bandages on a wound that was finally closing. At 11:15, I heard a car door. I went to the window. Ryan's sedan sat in the driveway with the engine running and the headlights off. The driver's door was open. The interior light cast a weak yellow glow across the gravel, but Ryan was not in the car. He was standing on the porch, and in his hand was an envelope. I opened the front door before he could knock. He looked terrible. His eyes were swollen. His shirt was wrinkled and untucked. He had not shaved, and the stubble on his jaw made him look older than 38, older than me, older than his own father, as if guilt had aged him overnight into someone I barely recognized. He held out the envelope. "I can't say this to your face," he said. His voice was hoarse. I tried. I sat in the bedroom all day and tried to figure out what to say, and every time I opened my mouth, nothing came out. He pushed the envelope toward me, so I wrote it down. I took the envelope. It was plain white, sealed, with nothing written on the outside. "Will you read it?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded. He stood there for a moment, looking at the porch railing freshly primed, the new wood bright under the porch light, and something crossed his face that might have been shame or recognition or both. "The porch looks good," he said quietly. "Martha Henderson," I said. He nodded again. Then he turned, walked to his car, and drove away without closing the door behind him. I watched his taillights disappear down the dirt road, 2 red dots swallowed by the Vermont dark. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages of lined notebook paper, written in Ryan's handwriting, the same handwriting I had taught him at this same table 32 years ago, when he was 6 and couldn't figure out how to make a lowercase g without it looking like the number 9. "Dad, I don't know how to start this, so I'll start with the truth. I am a coward. I have been a coward for 18 months, and before that, I was a coward in ways I didn't recognize because Brenda made it easy to be one. When I lost my job in Boston, I told you it was a company restructuring. That was a lie. I was fired because I missed 3 consecutive deadlines on a project I had stopped caring about. I stopped caring because Brenda and I were already falling apart, and I didn't have the courage to face either problem, the marriage or the job, so I let both of them collapse and then came home and let you carry the weight. I watched her move Mom's chair to the basement. I watched her sell the cows. I watched her bulldoze the garden. I watched her change the locks and throw your clothes on the porch. I watched all of it. And I did nothing. Not because I agreed with her, not because I didn't care, but because saying no to Brenda required a kind of strength I have never had. Mom had it. You have it. Rosie has it. I don't. When Craig Sullivan came with his blueprints and his numbers, I knew it was wrong. I knew what this land meant. I knew what Mom would have said. But Brenda had already signed preliminary papers, and I told myself it was too late. It is always too late when you are looking for an excuse not to fight. The night of the town meeting, when that lawyer stood up and said Mom had protected the land, I felt 2 things at the same time: relief and shame. Relief, because the land was safe. Shame, because Mom had to protect it from her own son's weakness. I should have been the one to protect it. I should have been the one to stand up at that meeting. I should have been the one to say no to Brenda the first time she mentioned selling. But I wasn't, and I have to live with that. Brenda left this morning. She took 2 suitcases and drove to her sister's in Massachusetts. She said she was done with this family, this town, and this worthless piece of dirt. Those were her exact words. Worthless piece of dirt. She said them standing in the kitchen where Mom made Thanksgiving dinner for 46 years. And I let her say them, and I let her leave. And I still said nothing. I am not writing this letter to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I am writing because you deserve to know the truth. And because Mom always said that the first step to fixing a broken fence is admitting which post rotted first. I am the post that rotted, Dad. I know that now. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I can come home. I don't know if you want me to. But I want you to know that I see what you did. I see what Mom did. I see what Rosie did. And I see what I didn't do. If there is still room on this land for someone who failed it, I would like to try again. Not today. Not tomorrow. But someday, when I have earned the right to stand on Whitfield ground again. Your son, Ryan. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along the same creases and placed it in the envelope. I pressed my palm flat against the table, Margaret's table, the table where I had taught my son to write, where we had eaten 10,000 meals, where Craig Sullivan had unrolled blueprints for a future that would never exist. The house was quiet. Rosie slept beneath the Blue Star quilt. The barn stood solid under new shingles. The garden held its ground in the dark. I placed Ryan's letter beside Margaret's letter in the pocket of my corduroy jacket. 2 letters. One from the woman who had protected everything. One from the son who had almost destroyed it. Both written in the handwriting of people I loved. I turned off the kitchen light. The darkness was not empty. It was full. Full of words and roots, and the slow, stubborn work of holding a family together when every force in the world was trying to pull it apart. Tomorrow I would figure out what to say to Ryan. Tonight, I would let the letters rest. 6 months passed. Winter came hard and left slowly. The way it always does in Vermont, freezing the ground in November, holding it hostage through March, then releasing it in April with a reluctance that felt personal. The snow piled against the barn walls and buried the fence posts the Kowalskis had driven in October. The garden disappeared beneath a white blanket, and I told myself the roots were sleeping, not dying. Margaret would have said the same thing. I spent the winter planning. The idea came to me on a Tuesday morning in January, standing in the empty barn with a cup of coffee and the sound of wind pressing against the new cedar shingles. The barn was clean, repaired, solid, and completely empty. 12 stalls built for dairy cows that were gone. A hayloft with nothing in it. A tack room with hooks that held nothing but dust. The barn was a body without a heartbeat. And I knew that if I left it empty long enough, the emptiness would spread to the house, then to the land, then to me. Doc Wheeler had said something the week after the town meeting that I couldn't stop thinking about. We were sitting on his porch watching the first snowfall, and he said, "You spent 42 years healing animals, George. Don't stop now just because you retired." I called him that Tuesday. I told him what I was thinking. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Margaret would have thought of it first." He was probably right. The concept was simple. An animal therapy center on the Whitfield farm, a place where rescued animals could live and people could come to heal alongside them. I had seen programs like it during my years as a veterinarian. Horses for veterans with PTSD, goats for children with anxiety, dogs for elderly patients in long-term care. The science was solid, the need was real, and I had 12 acres of protected land, an empty barn with 12 stalls, and 42 years of experience with animals who trusted me. I started with the paperwork. Alma Gutierrez helped me register the nonprofit, the Margaret Whitfield Animal Therapy Foundation. The name was Doc's suggestion. I didn't argue. The conservation easement allowed agricultural and educational use of the property, and Alma confirmed that an animal therapy program qualified under both categories. She filed the paperwork in February and charged me nothing. Martha Henderson organized the fundraising. She held a bake sale at the Methodist Church that raised $1,100 in a single Saturday. Mrs. Chen donated $2,000 from her late husband's savings, arriving at the farm with a check and a tin of homemade sesame cookies and the words, "Raymond would have wanted this." The Kowalskis donated lumber for new stall dividers and spent 2 weekends rebuilding the hayloft into a small classroom with benches and a whiteboard. Luis Morales knew a farrier in Montpelier who had 3 rescue horses looking for a permanent home. By March, the barn had 3 horses, a chestnut mare named Copper, a gray gelding named Ghost, and a paint named Juno, who had been rescued from a neglect case in Rutland. Doc Wheeler examined all 3 and declared them sound. I brushed them every morning, checked their hooves, and stood in the barn listening to the sound of animals breathing in stalls that had been empty for 18 months. The sound filled something inside me that I hadn't known was hollow. Rosie came every day after school. She took the bus to the end of the dirt road and walked the quarter-mile to the barn with her backpack bouncing and her ponytail coming undone. She had a gift with the horses. Copper followed her around the paddock like a dog. Ghost, who startled at everything. Trucks, birds. His own shadow stood perfectly still when Rosie pressed her forehead against his neck and whispered to him. She never told me what she said. I never asked. In April, the goats arrived. 4 Nigerian dwarf goats donated by a hobby farmer in Stowe who was moving to Florida. They were loud, stubborn, and ate everything they could reach, including the sleeve of my corduroy jacket when I bent down to check the fence. Rosie named them Maple, Clover, Biscuit, and Professor. Professor was the smallest and the loudest, and within a week he had claimed the top of the hay bale stack as his personal throne. The garden returned with the spring. Rosie and I replanted together on a Saturday in early April, kneeling side by side in the soil with packets of seeds spread between us. Coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, asters, daisies, and sunflowers, 3 rows of sunflowers along the southern fence, planted in the same pattern Margaret had established 46 years ago. Rosie pressed each seed into the earth with her thumb, the way Margaret had taught her. Grandma said sunflowers are the only flower stubborn enough to match a Whitfield. Rosie said. She was right. Am I stubborn enough? I looked at my granddaughter, dirt on her knees, seeds in her palms. Margaret's brown eyes steady and certain in her 10-year-old face. You're the most stubborn of all of us, I said. She grinned. It was Margaret's grin. I had not seen it in 2 years. By May, the first visitors came. A group of 8 veterans from a VA program in Burlington arrived on a Wednesday morning. Doc Wheeler and I led them to the barn. We didn't lecture. We didn't run a formal session. We just introduced them to the horses and the goats and let the animals do what animals do: stand close, breathe slow, and wait without judgment. One veteran, a young woman, maybe 26, with a scar along her jawline and hands that never stopped moving, stood beside Ghost for 20 minutes without speaking. When she finally stepped back, her hands were still. She looked at me and said, "He doesn't care what happened to me." "No," I said, "he doesn't. That's the first time anything hasn't cared in 3 years." She came back the following Wednesday. And the Wednesday after that, the farm was alive again. Not the way it had been, not 12 acres of working dairy land with 60 head of cattle and a schedule driven by milking times and market prices. It was something different. Something Margaret might have called its next chapter. The barn held animals that needed saving. The land held people who needed quiet. And the garden held flowers that Rosie tended every afternoon with the patience and stubbornness of every Whitfield woman who had knelt in that soil before her. I stood on the porch one evening in late May and watched the sun drop behind the mountains. The horses grazed in the pasture. Professor stood on his hay bale throne. Rosie chased Biscuit around the garden fence. The air smelled like cut grass and cedar shingles and the first blooms of Margaret's coneflowers. I reached into my jacket pocket and touched 2 letters. Margaret's and Ryan's. I carried them every day. I had not yet answered Ryan's letter, but I had started writing a response. 3 words on a blank page that I kept folding and unfolding. Come home, son. I wasn't ready to send it, but I was getting closer. I sent the letter on a Monday morning in June. 3 words on a single sheet of paper, folded once, sealed in a plain white envelope, the same kind Ryan had used when he stood on my porch at 11:15 on an October night and handed me his confession. Come home, son. I drove to the post office in town, handed the envelope to Barbara at the counter, and walked back to the truck. The whole thing took 4 minutes. 4 minutes to do what I had spent 8 months trying to find the courage for. Margaret would have done it in 4 seconds. She was always braver than me. She just never said it out loud. 3 days later, Ryan's sedan pulled into the driveway. I was in the barn brushing copper when I heard the engine. I set the brush on the stall door and walked outside. The June sun sat high and white above the pasture, and the air smelled like warm grass and the first of Margaret's sunflowers opening along the southern fence. Ryan stepped out of the car. He stood beside the open door for a long moment, looking at the farm the way a man looks at a place he thought he had lost forever. Slowly, carefully, as if it might disappear if he blinked. He looked different, thinner. His hair was shorter. He wore jeans and a plain gray t-shirt instead of the tie and pressed slacks Brenda had always insisted on. He looked like the boy I remembered, the one who helped me fix the pasture gate at 14, who fell asleep in the barn during calving season, who sat at Margaret's kitchen table every Sunday morning, eating pancakes and reading the comics section with syrup on his fingers. He closed the car door and walked toward me. He stopped about 10 feet away, the way you stop when you are close enough to speak but not sure you have the right. Dad. Ryan. Silence. The horses shifted in the pasture. Professor bleated from his hay bale throne. A breeze moved through the garden, and the coneflowers swayed purple and steady, the way Margaret planted them, the way Rosie replanted them, the way they would keep growing long after all of us were gone. I got your letter, he said. I know. 3 words. That's all I had. He looked at the barn, the new shingles, the mended fence, the paddock, where Ghost stood watching us with calm, dark eyes. He looked at the garden full now, June green and blooming, 3 rows of sunflowers reaching toward the sky like children stretching after a long sleep. You built all this, he said. Not alone. He nodded. His jaw tightened, and I saw the muscles work beneath the skin the way they did when he was a boy, trying not to cry at his first funeral, at Margaret's memorial, at every moment in his life, when the weight of feeling something became heavier than the weight of hiding it. I signed the divorce papers last week, he said. Brenda's staying in Massachusetts. She's not coming back. I waited. I sold the apartment in Boston. There's nothing left there. He paused. There's nothing left anywhere, except here. I looked at my son, 38 years old, standing on the land his great-grandfather cleared in 1921. His grandfather expanded, his father maintained, and his mother saved. 4 generations of Whitfield roots beneath his feet, and he was asking without saying the words if there was still room for a 5th. The barn needs someone to muck the stalls every morning, I said. Copper kicks if you approach from the left side. Professor eats anything that isn't nailed down, and Rosie will expect you to help with the garden on Saturdays. Ryan's face broke. Not the way it broke at the town meeting, not shame, not collapse. It broke the way frozen ground breaks in April, when the warmth finally reaches deep enough to thaw what winter tried to kill. His eyes filled. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time in 18 months, he looked at me without looking away. Okay, he said. Okay. He walked forward and put his arms around me. I held my son the way I had held him when he was 6, and afraid of thunderstorms, tight, steady, with both hands flat against his back so he could feel that I was solid, that I was not going anywhere, that the ground beneath us would hold. We stood like that for a long time. Long enough for the sun to shift. Long enough for Ghost to walk to the fence and press his nose through the rails. Long enough for the moment to become something neither of us would need to explain to anyone, because some things between a father and a son do not require language. They require only presence. That evening, Rosie arrived on the school bus. She walked the quarter-mile from the road, with her backpack bouncing, saw Ryan's car in the driveway, and stopped. She stood at the edge of the garden, her sneakers in the dirt, Margaret's brown eyes wide and uncertain. Ryan knelt down. He opened his arms. Rosie crossed the garden in 3 seconds flat. And the sound she made when she hit his chest was the sound of something that had been held together by sheer will finally being allowed to let go. Ryan pressed his face into her hair and held her, and I watched from the porch and thought about Margaret's letter, the one that said kindness was not weakness, that it was the strongest foundation she knew. She was right. She was always right. I sat on the porch that evening with Doc Wheeler. He had driven over without being asked, the way he always did when something important was happening at the Whitfield farm. We drank coffee and watched Ryan and Rosie in the pasture. Ryan was trying to convince Professor to come down from the hay bale. Professor was not convinced. Rosie was laughing so hard she had to sit in the grass. Margaret planned all of this, Doc said. Not all of it. The parts that mattered. I reached into my jacket pocket. 2 letters. Margaret's and Ryan's. I had carried them every day for 8 months, one against each side of my chest. I took them out and held them in my hands, 2 envelopes, 2 handwritings, 2 people I loved who had each, in their own way, asked me to hold on. I didn't need to carry them anymore. I walked inside and placed both letters in Margaret's Bible, between the pages of Psalms where her first note had been hidden. The Bible sat on the nightstand, back where it belonged. The letters rested between verses about mercy and endurance and the quiet, relentless work of faith. I walked back to the porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. The horses grazed. The garden bloomed. The barn stood solid on its stone foundation, the same foundation my grandfather had laid in 1921, the same foundation Margaret had protected, the same foundation that held everything above it steady and true. Doc looked at me. You all right, George? I looked at my farm, at my son kneeling in the grass, at my granddaughter laughing beside a stubborn goat, at the sunflowers turning their faces toward the last of the light, the way they always did, the way they always would. Yeah, I said, I'm all right. The land held. The family held. The foundation held. And Margaret somewhere in every root, every flower, every inch of Whitfield ground held most of all.